Beneath the shadows of the empire, a question echoed like a forbidden thunder. The Christ who saves, or the Demiurge who imprisons? Among marble palaces and burning deserts, secret voices whispered, "Creation is a prison. Salvation is escape." Rome believed it had silenced all rivals, yet in the heart of its provinces, an invisible battle threatened the very core of the Christian faith. It was not merely a clash between men, but between visions of God, a redeeming Christ, or a tyrant Demiurge, architect of a corrupted world. The Gnostic shock challenged not only the Church, but the imperial throne itself. For if creation were a prison, then every human power, even that of the emperor, would be nothing but illusion. And today, centuries later, this question still disturbs. You are now on Faith and Power, where the forbidden history of faith and empire is unveiled. Subscribe now, and do not miss the truth Rome tried to erase. Rome seemed eternal. Its columns rose like ribs of stone sustaining a body of glory, and its roads cut through the world like veins through which power flowed. Yet beneath this splendor, the soul of the empire was restless. From Jerusalem to Britannia, from the deserts of Egypt to the libraries of Alexandria, ideas collided like invisible armies. It was the 2nd century. The cross was still fresh in the memory of many, but the message of the crucified had already spread through taverns, workshops, and philosophical schools. The name of Christ echoed in synagogues, arenas, and marketplaces. Yet every mouth that spoke it gave it a different meaning. Among these voices rose a disturbing whisper, the Gnostic teachers. They did not speak with the authority of soldiers nor with the laws of the Senate, but with something far more dangerous, the promise of secret knowledge, a key beyond the visible world. Valentinus in Rome, Basilides in Alexandria, Marcion from Pontus, each was shaping communities that resembled neither the traditional synagogues nor the emerging churches that were beginning to organize. Their disciples gathered in discreet homes, candles lit, manuscripts hidden under cloaks, debating not whether Jesus was the Christ, but what kind of Christ he truly was. The empire was vast, but not infinite. The same ships that carried grain from Egypt also carried dangerous ideas. The roads that transported legions also transported scrolls. The Mediterranean, which Rome believed it dominated, was turning into an ocean of crossed messages. No one could stop this flow. Official Christianity was still being formed, seeking unity in the midst of persecution. But Gnosticism offered something that many Romans, Greeks, and Jews found neither in philosophy nor in the emerging faith, an explanation for the pain that suffocated the world. If God is good, why does so much misery exist? That was the wound Gnosticism touched. In the alleys of Rome, where children begged for bread, in the mines where slaves died nameless, in the arenas stained with blood, where Christians' bodies were burned as human torches, the world seemed more like hell than paradise. Then came the Gnostic answer. Perhaps this world was not created by the supreme God. Perhaps it had been fashioned by a lesser being, arrogant, ignorant of the divine fullness, a demiurge. Through this lens, suffering ceased to be an insoluble mystery. It became proof that we lived in a cosmic prison. The soul, a lost spark of the true light, was trapped in flesh and bone. And the mission of Christ? To free us, not only from sin, but from matter itself. Gnosticism spoke as a parallel gospel, but its sound was as seductive as it was dangerous. Rome, however, was a stage of contrasts. While senators forged alliances and generals marched to the frontiers, carpenters, merchants, and philosophers were drawn to these preachers of mystery. Words traveled faster than imperial edicts. In the suburbs of Carthage, a merchant could hear of Sophia, the fallen Aeon. In Ephesus, a craftsman might be initiated into a secret rite of revelation. In Rome, a young student could be captivated by the eloquence of Valentinus, who nearly won the episcopal seat of the very capital. Gnosticism was not a marginal faith for a few. It was a silent earthquake. Its strength lay in offering a radical alternative to the apostolic narrative. While bishops proclaimed, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us," the Gnostics retorted, "Flesh is a prison, and only knowledge can open the bars." And this tension was not only theological, it was political. For if the material world was the work of a flawed craftsman, then the empire itself, with its laws, coins, and temples, was nothing more than an illusory construction. The Roman order, which proclaimed itself eternal, could be seen as nothing but a gilded cage. And if that were true, where would the emperor's authority, proclaimed as son of the gods, truly stand? Meanwhile, official Christian communities struggled to survive persecution. In the catacombs of Rome, martyrs sealed their faith with blood, believing that creation was good and that resurrection would be bodily. But in the hidden rooms of Alexandria, some masters whispered, "The true resurrection has already happened, when you received gnosis, the awakening of your soul." It was an invisible duel, but a fierce one. It was not only about which faith would save souls, but about which narrative would uphold or erode the empire. For if men believed that this world was a deception, Rome's power could evaporate like smoke. And so, beneath marble domes, in noisy marketplaces, on the banks of the Nile, and in the mountains of Syria, two Christianities advanced side by side, one of martyrs and churches, the other of secrets and revelations, and neither was willing to yield. The stage was set. The battle would not be fought only in arenas, but in words, scrolls, and visions. And at the heart of this struggle, the question thundered once again, Christ or Demiurge? In the shadowy corridors of the houses where Gnosticism flourished, a cosmic drama was told as if it were ancestral memory. It was not merely religion, it was myth, whispered in murmurs, illuminated by oil lamps that flickered as though the universe itself breathed while listening. In the beginning, they said, there was no temple nor throne but the pleroma, the divine fullness, the ocean of light where the aeons dwelt. Among them, Sophia, wisdom, dared to desire what lay beyond her measure, to know the inaccessible. From her fall came forth something dissonant, a lesser being, arrogant, ignorant of the true source. This being, the Demiurge, shaped the material world with stones, rivers, and flesh, but without the love of the Father's perfection. On the lips of the Gnostic masters, Genesis was rewritten. Where Moses saw a powerful God declaring, "Let there be light," the Gnostics saw a limited craftsman, creating not out of fullness, but out of error. And if the cosmos was the result of a flaw, then human suffering was no mystery. It was the inevitable consequence of material imprisonment. Into this dark stage entered Christ, but not as the carpenter of Nazareth, not as the teacher who healed lepers or broke bread. The Gnostic Christ was an emissary sent from the pleroma, descending like a lightning bolt into a world of shadows. His mission was not to redeem human sin with blood shed on the cross, but to awaken the dormant spark within each soul. Not to save the body, for the body was a cage, but to liberate consciousness, guiding it back to the source. This narrative sounded like music to many. Slaves, women, philosophers disenchanted with Rome, all could hear in it a promise of escape. Social status did not matter, nor did the law of the empire. All that was needed was to receive gnosis, the secret knowledge, and the soul could ascend, beyond the false gods, beyond the rulers who governed this world. But the bishops did not hear mere poetry in this doctrine. They saw an abyss. To them, denying the goodness of creation was to deny the very heart of faith. For if, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, then all matter bore the mark of holiness. And if the Word became flesh, then flesh was not a prison, but an altar. The clash was inevitable. On one side, masters like Irenaeus of Lyon wrote with fury, "If Christ did not assume the flesh, there is no redemption." On the other, Gnostic preachers whispered, "If Christ took on flesh, it was only appearance, shadow, an illusion to deceive the Demiurge." The dogma of incarnation collided with the myth of spiritual liberation. The conflict grew even sharper when the cross was reinterpreted. To the apostles, the cross was victory, surrender, love that allowed itself to be wounded. To many Gnostics, the cross was theater. The true Christ never suffered, never bled, but only allowed the apparent body to be crucified, like a garment discarded. Suffering was illusion, and to believe in blood was to remain blind. Such teaching turned Christianity into an internal battlefield. For if Christ did not suffer, then the martyrs dying in the arenas had perished in vain. If the flesh held no value, then every sacrifice was absurd. The faith that sustained persecuted communities began to erode under the possibility that it was all deception. Rome, even without grasping every detail, perceived the danger. For Gnosticism, by denying the order of creation, also undermined the imperial order. If this world was a prison, then the emperor's throne was nothing but a golden chain, and if Christ had not truly taken flesh, then the very notion of divine authority in history was shattered. Public squares and philosophical schools became the stages of this struggle. In Alexandria, Origen debated Gnostics before crowded audiences. In Rome, catecheses were held in secret to protect the faithful from Valentinus's influence. Each city became an invisible arena where words replaced spears. What disturbed the church most was that the Gnostics did not present themselves as enemies of Christ. On the contrary, they claimed to be the true interpreters of his mission. To them, the bishops were trapped in shadows, defending the lower god as if he were the supreme, and the Church, in its pursuit of unity, saw in this a poison disguised as revelation. The common people were left divided. On one side, the faith handed down by presbyters who risked their lives. On the other, the promise of a deeper gospel, reserved for the perfect. It was as though two stories ran side by side, one of flesh and blood, the other of light and secrecy. Thus, between hidden papyri and fiery sermons, the question ignited the heart of the empire. Who was Christ truly? Liberator from matter or word made flesh? Son of the invisible Father, or mere appearance meant to confuse the Demiurge? The clash was not academic, but existential. For each soul, the answer determined whether the world was a path to redemption or a cursed trap. And this tension, far from resolution, only grew, preparing the next act of the battle. The empire was not built only on walls and legions. It was built on words, and words, inscribed on scrolls, carved into marble, or whispered in public squares, could prove more powerful than the steel of any sword. The second and early, third centuries were a battlefield of silence, where books became spears and librarians, invisible generals. Alexandria, the city of lights, was the heart of this combat. Its libraries preserved the echoes of Plato, Aristotle, and Moses. Yet they also sheltered Gnostic treatises that passed from hand to hand. Young students sought there not only the eloquence of philosophy, but secret keys to free the soul. It was fertile ground for masters who promised hidden truths. In this setting arose Clement of Alexandria. With his pen, he struck against the poison of gnosis, though not with blind fury. He sought dialogue, transforming the philosophical logos into a bridge to the true Christ. He wrote as one who builds a wall, arguing that true gnosis was not flight from creation, but a plunge into the mystery of God made man. For Clement, true knowledge did not despise the flesh, it elevated it. Beside him emerged Origen, a restless genius whose mind seemed larger than any library. From youth he devoured scrolls as one drinks water. Yet he was not merely a scholar. He lived austere, fasting, sleeping on the floor, offering his body to suffering as testimony that matter could be disciplined, not despised. Origen debated Gnostics with vigor, declaring that Christ brought not only knowledge, but eternal life, and that to deny his incarnation was to destroy the hope of resurrection. But it was not only in Alexandria that the battle raged. In Rome, the voice of Irenaeus of Lyon thundered. Formed in the tradition of Polycarp, who had heard the apostles directly, Irenaeus wrote against heresies with devastating force. His Adversus Hereses became a sharpened sword. In it, he exposed Gnostic myths in detail, only to dismantle them before his audience. If Christ did not assume the flesh, there is no salvation, he hammered. For him, the Son of God redeemed not only the soul, but the body and all of history. It was an intellectual war, but not a cold one. It was lived drama. In the streets, poor Christians looked to their leaders for direction. In the underground, martyrs sang hymns before the beasts, trusting their bodies would rise glorified. Every argument of the bishops bore the weight of lives at stake. For if Gnostic faith triumphed, martyrdom would lose its meaning, and the church itself would dissolve into secrets. The Gnostics, however, did not fall silent. Their schools flourished, their works multiplied. Some texts circulated in such beautiful language that even simple believers were captivated. In the halls of Alexandria, masters taught of the aeons, of the fallen Sophia, of the imprisoned spark. Many believed they were hearing a revelation deeper than any episcopal homily. Thus, libraries became battlefields. There were no walls but shelves, no spears but scrolls. Whoever mastered words would master the faith. The Gnostics wagered on the allure of secrecy, the bishops on the authority of apostolic tradition. Rome watched from afar, not grasping every detail, yet sensing something crucial was at stake. The empire needed a religion to uphold order, not a faith that declared the world an illusion. Gnosticism eroded the very foundation of power, the legitimacy of the throne. The Church, though persecuted, upheld a faith that affirmed the goodness of creation and the hope of resurrection. It was more compatible with imperial logic, though still dangerous. Public squares became auditoriums. Debates were inflamed. Young students chose sides. Some saw in the Gnostics liberators of the mind, others traitors of the cross. Every argument was an arrow fired into the heart of a generation. Time marched forward, and the tension did not diminish. It grew. Gnostic codices multiplied, hidden in caves and deserts, awaiting centuries to be discovered. Meanwhile, bishops organized lists of writings, seeking to define which gospels were true and which must be rejected. The canon began to take shape in the heat of this struggle. Libraries burned, yet ideas survived. Martyrs fell, yet their stories strengthened faith. The clash was not merely between masters and disciples, but between two visions of reality, a cosmos as sacred gift, or a cosmos as prison. In the end, no one could ignore the force of this struggle. Every city of the empire breathed its tension. Every believer lived its doubt. The world awaited a decision. The Battle of Scrolls was but the prelude to a greater conflict, one that would soon involve not only books, but crowns. The empire was changing. The martyrs who once burned as human torches were now becoming symbols of moral power. Rome, weary of persecution, began to realize that this unbreakable faith could be used rather than destroyed. Yet the Gnostic shock still echoed like venom in the church's veins, and imperial politics soon found in this conflict an opportunity for control. When Constantine raised the standard of the cross in battle, the world changed forever. Christianity, once persecuted, now marched into palaces. But this ascent did not erase the shadows of heresy. On the contrary, it intensified them. For now, faith was not merely the hope of slaves and martyrs. It was the cement of imperial order. If internal divisions remained, even the crown itself would tremble. The bishops gathered in councils were no longer merely spiritual shepherds. They had become senators of a new sacred assembly, where every decision shaped the future of the empire. And at the center of this board lay the question of the true Christ. If he were only an ethereal emissary, as the Gnostics preached, then the incarnation lost its value. And if the incarnation were denied, the bond between heaven and earth was severed. But it was precisely that bond the empire needed to legitimize its power. Constantine understood the force of this detail. By adopting the cross, he did not seek merely spiritual victory, but political unification. He knew an empire divided by rival narratives of Christ could not endure. For this reason, he encouraged bishops to combat not only external persecutions, but internal heresies. Thus, the struggle against Gnosticism ceased to be a merely theological matter. It became state policy. Laws were enacted. Suspect texts were hunted down. Gospels deemed apocryphal were buried, burned, or forgotten. The church, now strengthened by the crown, decreed, there was only one true Christ, the one who took on flesh, suffered, died, and rose again. It was the message that sustained the faith, but also legitimized the empire. For if flesh was good and resurrected, then history had meaning. And if history had meaning, the Roman throne could be seen as part of the divine plan. Yet the Gnostics did not vanish overnight. In the deserts of Syria, in the depths of Egypt, communities continued to whisper their mysteries. Their codices circulated in secret, hidden from imperial eyes. Some preferred death to abandoning gnosis. To them, the church now united with the crown was not the triumph of truth, but betrayal of the spiritual Christ. They claimed the bishops had traded the freedom of light for the shadow of power. The conflict took on dramatic tones. On one side, triumphant processions, cathedrals rising upon the ruins of pagan temples, emperors attending liturgy as though they were new Moses figures. On the other, monks in the desert, hiding forbidden books in clay jars, convinced they would one day be rediscovered. It was a war of silence against trumpets, of caves against palaces, and the tension did not fade. Even among the faithful of the official church, the Gnostic temptation persisted. Those who saw the corruption of the court, the luxury of powerful bishops, and the distance between gospel and practice could not help but wonder, were the Gnostics right in saying that the world was illusion and that true salvation lay beyond matter? Thus, crown and cross became ambiguous symbols. The cross, once a mark of shame, was now an imperial insignia. Yet the more it gleamed on banners, the more some Christians suspected that its meaning was being used as a political tool. The Gnostic shock continued to wound the heart of the empire, not with armies, but with questions no sword could silence. The centuries advanced, and the church, strengthened by imperial power, consolidated dogmas, closed the canon, and persecuted heresies. Yet like embers hidden beneath ashes, the Gnostic texts survived, awaiting the day they would be unearthed. What seemed buried was only sleeping. And so the marriage between faith and empire brought unity, but also a wound that would never fully heal. For behind the triumphal arches and golden crowns, the question still echoed, a question no emperor, no council, no sword could erase: Christ or Demiurge. The sun burned mercilessly over the Egyptian desert in 1945, when two peasants dug into the sand in search of fertilizer for their fields. What they unearthed was not fertile soil, but jars sealed for centuries. When they broke them open, they revealed leather-bound codices, fragile yet intact. Inside were forgotten words, the voices of silenced masters, gospels banned by the imperial church. It was as though the desert itself had preserved in silence the memory of the Gnostic shock. These texts, now known as the Nag Hammadi codices, unveiled to the modern world what bishops and emperors had once tried to erase. Alternative gospels, hymns, treatises, and visions that presented another Christ, another narrative, another key to existence. There was the Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus does not offer sacrifice, but riddles. There was the Gospel of Philip, speaking of the mysteries of spiritual union. There was the Apocryphon of John, describing the fall of Sophia and the birth of the Demiurge. It was like opening a window into a parallel universe. For centuries, historians had known the Gnostics only through the refutations of their enemies. Now, for the first time, their own voices could be heard, and those voices thundered across the centuries. The impact was devastating. Some scholars saw in them proof that Christianity could have taken another path, perhaps more mystical, perhaps more free. Others recognized the depth of the conflict. The Church had not merely defeated the Gnostics with arguments, but with imperial power. Decrees, fire, and silence. The official canon was written not only by the pen, but also by the sword. Yet these texts were not only historical documents, they were existential challenges. "The kingdom is within you," one saying declared. To many, this sounded like spiritual liberation. To others, like a threat to dissolve faith into secret individualism. It was the same tension of the 2nd century, now resurrected in modern times. The discoverers, simple peasants, could never have imagined the weight of what they held in their hands. The codices were soon smuggled, sold, studied, and disputed between museums and universities. Each fragment seemed to carry gunpowder, capable of exploding long-established certainties. And yet the desert had preserved those words for nearly 1,600 years. Who had hidden them? Monks from the monastery of St. Pachomius. Gnostic disciples, fleeing repression? No one knows for certain, but the act of burying those books was not merely fear, it was hope. Hope that one day, in another time, someone would hear those voices again. The modern world, in opening those codices, did not find easy answers. It found dilemmas. If those gospels had prevailed, what would Christianity look like today? Would we have temples or only schools of mystery? Stone crosses or only riddles written on papyri? What was lost when Rome united crown and cross? But perhaps the most disturbing question was another. Why do these ideas, buried in the desert, still speak so powerfully to modern hearts? Perhaps because the human dilemma remains the same. We look upon wars, misery, corruption, and still ask, if God is good, why is the world so cruel? The Gnostic answer remains tempting. Perhaps this world is not the work of the supreme God. Perhaps we are still prisoners, and yet the Church's reply continues to echo. Creation is good, flesh is worthy, and Christ truly suffered to redeem not only souls, but bodies. It is a battle without end, fought now not in the libraries of Alexandria, but in academic debates, on digital networks, within human consciences. The sands of Nag Hammadi revealed not only texts, they revealed that the Gnostic shock never truly ended. It crosses the centuries, questioning faith, challenging power, forcing every soul to decide which Christ it will follow. The spiritual liberator who denies matter, or the incarnate Son who redeems creation. And perhaps this is the deepest legacy of those buried jars, to remind us that history is not only dead past, but an open wound. A wound that still bleeds in the heart of humanity. Centuries have passed, empires have fallen, and still we walk among the ruins of Rome and the echoes of its churches. Yet the question that once divided masters and martyrs, bishops and Gnostics, remains alive like a secret fire. Who is Christ? The incarnate Son who takes on flesh and history, or the emissary who came to free us from an illusory world? This tension does not belong only to the past. It burns in every heart that suffers, in every gaze that contemplates pain and asks, why does evil exist? Some still take refuge in the Gnostic Christ, who offers escape. others in the Christ of the cross, who offers redemption. Rome tried to bury the dispute, but the desert returned the voices. And now, before us, the choice remains. Christ or Demiurge, prison or creation, illusion or redemption. You have just crossed a forgotten conflict, but not a defeated one. If this story stirred your faith, if it opened wounds or ignited questions, subscribe now to Faith and Power, because what was silenced by crown and cross, here speaks again.